right, I think we're live. If anyone can hear me, just push 1 or say something that you can actually hear me.
Mike, are you there? Hello?
Can you hear me?
Finally. The thing is that I don't know what it is with this stupid thing. First, it told me that the mic was not muted.
Your mic was not muted?
Well, my mic was muted, but it told me that it wasn't at some point.
Okay.
And then I couldn't find it. And it's one of the joys of dealing with this technology when you're depending on a talking screen reader to tell you what's on the screen. And sometimes what you get to see on the screen, depends on what it's able to see. And please tell me we're not on video.
No, we are not on video, but everyone can hear you. We are live right now, so.
No, I know. It's just that I'm in my room and it's pretty messy.
Yeah, no, just give me 30 seconds. Let me copy all the links over and then we'll get started.
Sure, no problem.
Just give me a second.
One of these days, you're going to have to show me how to transmit from Zoom to YouTube.
It does it automatically. So you point it to your YouTube channel and Zoom will take care of the rest.
I see.
It's 3 or 4 mouse clicks, and then everything is done. Before it was a lot more complex than that, but now they have simplified the process. And so I wish we had more people showing up, but I understand people are maybe in transit right now. But if you're listening to the playback, welcome back to Engineered Disaster Talk, episode 2. Here with my co-host, Martha. And how are you doing, Martha?
And I'm doing fine. And I want to thank you once again for driving this technology, because no way, Jose, would I have been able to do it. And I want to say hello to whoever eventually listens to us.
Yes.
And those that may be listening now.
Yes, absolutely. And so today's topic is about the current administration and all of the calamities that come with the current administration and the things that are going on in recent time. There's a myriad of things that are happening just in the last 90 days, or not the last 30 days. We're dealing with a pandemic. We went over that the first episode. We're dealing with economic downturn. We're dealing with a trade war with China. We're dealing with mass protests and demonstrations because of the injustices of law enforcement. Okay, a lot of things that are happening, but so we're going to try to extrapolate all of these things today in the next 60 minutes. And so what I'll do is I'll turn this over to Martha and see what she has on her itinerary for all of these issues that are coming up in terms of disaster.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that we need to bear in mind as we contemplate these events is that what is happening goes beyond the murder of George Floyd. And I don't know if it's the media, creating a sort of situation where, people's memory sort of like, they seem to encourage a lot of short memory. So they're basically treating this as if it were somehow the worst or the first or another rare occurrence of police violence. And I'm going to suggest that people read an article that appeared on Minpress News. I think it was 2 weeks ago, and it's called 19 Facts About US Policing That Will Blow Your Mind. And it's written by Lee Camp, who he has a program on RT called Redacted Tonight. And one of the things that he starts off with is by reminding us that the police in the United States kill an estimate of 900 to 1,000 people per year. And that statistic was corroborated by a professor of Bowling Green State University criminal justice program. His name is Philip Stinsoff. And so he says that from 900 to 1,000 people are killed a year by police. And this is not, as people might think, a normal occurrence. Other countries, the numbers are far less. And he points out, for instance, that in the first 24 days of January of 2015, the police in the United States killed more people than England and Wales have done in 24 years. And he says, that between January 1st and January the 24th, cops in the United States killed 59 people. This was in 2015. By contrast, according to Inquest, which is a UK advocacy group, they killed 55 people, right? The police in England and Wales. But this was between 1990 and 2014, so 24 years. And the problem is that for all that crime has been at times sensationalized by the news media, most of the killings that the cops are involved in are killings where no firearms were carried by the victims of these police crimes. There weren't any kind of, like the anticipation of a violent arrest. There's a mental health advocacy group that talks, that says that 1 out of every 4 people killed by the police are people that have mental health issues. And then, of course, you see the cases, of the killings, that have provoked the most attention from people. All of the people have been disarmed. Most of the people weren't even in the process of, being pursued to be arrested, like in the case of, Philando Castro, or the medical technician that was killed in Kentucky, Breonna.
Breonna Taylor.
Yes. And so, you have cops that most of what they do is essentially, they're not even pursuing, like murder investigations. There's a professor by the name of Alex Vitale who says that most cops average less than 1 felony arrest per year. That even detectives who, they compose 15% of the police force, most of them are involved, are involved in investigations that they're not going to solve, or they're taking reports of investigations that they're not even going to delve into. Mm-hmm. So this is what's, this is basically what is going on. And the reason that, the factors that make this possible is that you have the government creating all kinds of non-offensive crimes, loitering in the streets, begging, feeding the homeless, sleeping in your car is now a crime.
Minor infractions.
Huh?
Minor infractions.
They're minor infractions. They're so-called crimes that harm absolutely no one. And this is what these cops spend most of their time pursuing. And so what they allow is two things. Obviously, they allow for more opportunities in which they can go and brutalize and kill people. And the other thing is that the purpose of these laws is to put people in the system, to create a situation where you have mass incarceration. And, if you get arrested for one or two non-offensive crimes, quote unquote, then the next time you get arrested, there's a strong likelihood that your sentence is going to be a lot higher.
It's interesting that you bring, I don't mean to interrupt you, but it's interesting that you bring this up, because you talk about sleeping in your car, being in your car, right? In Ferguson, Darren Wilson was one of the officers who was known to ticket Black people in Ferguson for sitting in their car and smoking a cigarette, and give them an actual a ticket for a moving violation on a vehicle that they were just parked in, having a cigarette in their own driveway.
Yeah, and they're parked in a public place. It's their own car. I mean, whose property are they infringing upon for this?
Right.
Whose rights are they violating?
Right.
Whose property are they putting in danger for doing this? Mm-hmm. So it's, yes, we know that there is a very trigger happy, racist, not almost, a genocidal culture within the US police. But a lot of the legislators that today are crying crocodile tears over the murder of George Floyd, and that are talking about the extensive reforms that need to be carried out so that this doesn't happen anymore. A lot of those people are responsible for what have happened, because they're the ones who create the laws that allow the police to intervene with people in a multiplicity of ways.
Yes. And what happens when they go after the victims for minor infractions, they nickel and dime them. So, and they add interest on top of it. So a person who may be sitting in their car sleeping may get their car impounded, which means that they got to pay $200+ to take it out of the impound, and then pay the ticket as well. The ticket may accrue interest on it, 10% every week or whatever it is. And that's another $100. So the city just made, or the state just made $500 on this poor person.
Now imagine that being done to a homeless person.
Right.
And how much more, economic difficulties you create for that person by subjecting them to this. Yeah. But the other thing about this type of arrest is that it's very similar. It's very interesting how much US foreign policy, and particularly military foreign policy, is seeping into the police practices of the US, because as I said, the purpose of these so-called offenses and the cops going after people constantly over them, is in order to put people in the judicial system, to be able to have an excuse to track them, to have an excuse to give them longer sentences. And in a climate of privatized prisons, and where industries are going into the prisons, to get their labor, that's almost like instituting slavery. But in addition to that, they did this very thing in Vietnam. In South Vietnam, they had the bulk of the population of that territory tracked through this very process of going after them for lesser offenses. And interestingly enough, this is what the Israelis do to the Palestinians constantly. So it's interesting because it's another way in which people have often referred to people of color in the United States as internal colonies. So we're not treated like internal colonies just because we're brutalized more by the police, just because the police in general, in its aggressivity, behaves like an occupation force, but also in the way that they constantly track the population, all of the policies of tracking, of keeping track of people, of making sure that they know what they're doing, of having easy access to incarcerate them, all of those things that they carry out in Iraq, that they've carried out in Vietnam, that they probably carry out in Afghanistan, that is carried out in Palestine, is now being practiced in the United States.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I just wanted to make sure I finished the statement I was making before, that when the person gets their car impounded for this sort of moving violation, their license is also suspended at almost automatically, because they they either didn't have the proper tags or some other sort of compliance that they weren't able to fulfill. And so there's a cascading effect of penalizing poor people within the system, which keeps them in the cyclical loop of poverty and criminality, or at least within the criminal injustice system. And so when we look at this as a whole, we can see why the protests are starting to spark up, as we see in this photo right here for George Floyd protests. And what's interesting is that the police are hiding behind all of this military riot gear. And so I don't know if you have any more articles you want to cover, but I do have an article that discusses, the question of the 1033 program.
Yes, please.
Yeah, just give me a second. Let me pull this up. Go right here.
And while you look for that, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What does this constant penalizing of people, like if you penalize someone because, they slept in their car and now the car is impounded and they got their license taken away from them, how much does that affect them in a Corey background check when they go looking for work and housing?
It can, and it may or may not affect them. Depends on who they go to work for. You want to work for a private institution, they may not care that much, but if you try to go work for a government agency, then yeah, they may ding you on it, right? So it depends on, it could also impact your housing, because now if you have any sort of discrepancies in your background, the landlord or whoever the agency is may deny you based on the
Good
fact
Lord.
So and so this is from CBS News. Brawls during protests renew calls to halt police access to military weapons. And so the 1033 program that was restarted by the Tangerine Tyrant, is now being called into
Or
question.
bunker boy, as they call him.
Yeah, yeah. And so this program is involved in transferring military-grade equipment to local law enforcement. And so why is this important is because law enforcement is another extension of the military, which is the Praetorian Guard of the institution of white supremacy, okay? You don't need military grade, you don't need mine resistant ambush protected vehicles in an urban zone, okay, with civilians. You don't need that, you know? And so going into November, the Tangerine Tyrant has 3 issues on his hands. He has the 1033 program, which is what this police disbanding of the police is really about, right? The 1033 program is a part, the suspension of it is a part of this disbanding. Stop transferring military equipment to local law enforcement. They don't need it. You don't need a 20-ton armored vehicle in the civilian area where people barely have the ability to own arms in the first place. What's interesting about that is they're not so concerned about these fireworks that blow people's hands off every year, but they're more concerned about, you know, small caliber weapons that America thrives on, right? The Second Amendment that they thrive on so much. They're not so much as worried about the fireworks that are legally possessed by most of the gringos. But that's another another day. But the 1033 program is in question now. The Tangerine Tyrant may have to suspend this. But if he does suspend it, that means law enforcement will not go out and vote for him and support him, and may become disgruntled because of the police unions who back up the law enforcement agencies around the country. You know, they are not going to be too happy about not being able to receive all of this nice military equipment that they themselves don't have to pay for. Okay, we don't even know where the money's coming from. You know, in Massachusetts, they have a shadow account or some kind of configuration set up where you can't really pry into where the money's coming from. You don't know where it's coming from. All you just know is that they received a lot of this equipment and a lot of this training. Even things such as tactical pens, so that, you know, SWAT team and law enforcement can write down, you know, your name and whatnot on pieces of paper. Tactical pens that cost $100. Who knew that type of thing even existed? And so taxpayer money is going to pay for a lot of these things. And law enforcement is looking at this, or will look at this and say, well, we want our nice, shiny military equipment. This program is great for us, but if you're talking about suspending it, then we won't police the area. We'll just let crime go, you know, run amok. And what they go ahead.
They're in a really sticky wicket, because one thing is to employ all that weaponry on people that have been routinely marginalized. But as we're seeing with these protests, it is now reaching people that had never experienced police violence before, or at least not to this degree. And so, you know, to the extent that you have this, you lose the ability to have a layer of people that will always support your domestic repressive policies. So, yeah, he wants to enforce this. The cops want this, but it looks like larger segments of the population are not going to be going for it.
Yeah, he says he's the president of law and order. Okay, law and order. That's what he's the president of. You know, as we see,
as he hides in a bunker.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He's hiding in the
with the lights turned off.
Yeah. He's hiding in the basement. You know, he said he's looking for some old pictures, you know, from the previous administration.
Yeah.
So, you know, my point in saying this is that what's happening here is that he's been pinned into a corner now. Either he supports the 1033 program and more riots come all the way into November. This is not going to stop. People are not working. They have a lot of time on their hands and they're very angry and they're very hungry too because they're not getting paid.
Exactly.
You take that into consideration, and then going into November, that could be a disaster for him, okay? Now he takes it off the table, and now you have law enforcement across the country, 18,000 departments and agencies that will be angry with him. They have a lot of power from the position that they're in, mostly because they have the ability to enforce laws. And so he is in a bind. This is a big problem. 1033 program, a trade war with China that's going to inflate the price of goods that most Americans can't afford because they're not working. And then you take into consideration this pandemic with a second wave coming in of COVID. That's a problem because he's dropping the ball on us as well. He wants to reopen an economy to a bunch of angry people. At this time, does not sound like a good idea going into November. Big problems for the president. So, but if you elect a clown, you should expect a circus.
Exactly. But the thing is that the cops don't have much alternative either, because they have Orange Bunker Boy on the one hand, who may not be able to deliver for them on this program, and you also have Bunker Boy Light in the person of Joe Biden, who will be, no matter how bellicose he's been before about his so-called anti-crime legislation, this is going to be a very difficult climate in which he would be able to implement, let alone advocate for something like this.
So the next item I just wanted to bring up was from Coco.com. U.S. Marine Corps order removal of Confederate flags, including on clothing, bumper stickers, and mugs. So this is getting really deep now. You have the military saying, no, we're not going to support any of these white supremacist symbols that date back to a war that was lost by the terrorists. Okay, the Confederate Army were a bunch of terrorists. They took on the federal government of the United States at the time in revolt, and they lost the war. And so, why hold on to these symbols? Well, and the military is saying no. Tangerine Tyrant says, yeah, in Michigan, the state of Michigan, you had nationalists go up to the state house armed with guns, 100 cars deep, 100-car convoy. Can you imagine the 100-car convoy of Black and brown people of color,
Well, can you imagine if AIM or the Panthers would have done that back in the 70s?
Yeah, well, the 70s, they did have guns. So in the 70s, they did have arms, but
they weren't tolerated.
They changed the laws, so they were within the laws. The difference here is that you have angry white nationals who storm a state house and take over it and force the government to their knees. But when it comes to peaceful protesters, they're being beat, pepper sprayed, run over by police vehicles, rubber bullets. They're being tased in some areas. They're using military helicopters, about 120 feet, 150 feet above the protesters and kind of intimidate them. A myriad of things of how they go about dealing with them is really questionable on the character of the president himself. And so he supports gun owners going up to the state house in Michigan, but doesn't support peaceful protesters in Minneapolis. So he sends Predator drones. Okay, these are this is military technology used in Baghdad and used in Afghanistan to survey military warfare. being used on civilians to detect who's in the crowd and who's doing what out there when they're just peaceful protests. They're not armed.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, I mean, did you see what happened between last week and the week before last? I mean, in Seattle, Washington, there was a protest against the killing of George Floyd, where a white supremacist jumps out of a black sedan. He shoots at the protest, and as people scatter, he's able to calmly walk over to the police lines. And though they say they apprehended him, they didn't arrest him the way they arrest the demonstrators at these protests. They didn't beat him bloody. They didn't throw him on the ground. They didn't shoot him with rubber bullets. They didn't pummel him with their clubs. They didn't, spray tear gas on him. In fact, they shielded him. They surrounded him in a way that enabled him to remain protected from any reactions that might come from the people that he shot at. Mm-hmm. And then in Bakersfield, California, there was another white supremacist who hit one of the protesters, right? Mm-hmm. And actually the protester died as a result of his injury. His name is Robert Forbes. And the cops claimed that the injuries he had, though they were the injuries that he died from, were only moderate to major. And then they blamed the protesters for being on the road. They basically excused this hit and run by saying that it's the demonstrators' fault because they were there on the street doing what they're supposed to be able to do, which is to protest peacefully. Yeah. And they do this all the while, that they're shooting journalists. There's a journalist by the name of Linda Tirado who was blinded in one eye from a rubber bullet. We saw them arresting journalists, on live television, and beating up the medics, at a time of COVID-19. Yes, they are so invested in protecting life that they've made it a point to injure and arrest medical workers. There's a medical person in New York by the name of Rain Valentine, who, as he was coming out of his job, for Christ's sakes, he wasn't even at a demonstration. As he was coming out of his job, the cops basically knocked him down and clubbed him and kicked him and beat him until he fell unconscious. And then he had to go back to, his own place of work to be patched up, and his coworkers had to put 7 staples on his head to keep him from bleeding.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and it's pretty disgusting. A lot of this stuff that we're seeing, it's hard to actually sit down and watch it. Meanwhile, in Hong Kong, the United States government is supporting all of the protesting or the rioting down there. Okay, some of the most horrific. What's happening here is very minor in comparison to what's going on in Hong Kong right now, or what was going on in Hong Kong pre-COVID. Very grotesque things, that was happening, and the Hong Kong Police Department was not able to subdue a lot of these type of things that were happening. They were outnumbered.
It's like Venezuela. They're basically financing people to not only protest against their government, but to actually go after, civilians in their own countries and beat them and harm them because either they won't join the protest, or because in China there was a lawyer who was beaten up in one of the protests because he was trying to prevent them the demonstrators from obstructing traffic. In Venezuela, the peaceful protests that the US defends have done things like burn people alive because of the color of their skin or because they look like supporters of the government. They've said, Abby Martin has covered this in the Empire Files. They've tried to set entire highways on fire. They've set child care centers, like a child care center in El Chacao. They went and they set it on fire during the protests of 2014 and 15. So, those protesters need to be supported because the United States has an agenda in those countries, usually having to do with resource theft. But then, people who are engaging in nonviolent protests in the US, can be beaten up, bloodied, and even killed.
Yes.
And one interesting thing about the the contrast of the Hong Kong protests and the protests in the United States is that in the Hong Kong protests, nobody has gotten killed. The police have not killed anybody, whereas in the United States, it's like 13 or 15 people that have been killed by now.
Oh yeah. We don't know how many have been, have severe injuries, head trauma and things of that nature, limb impartialments and things of that nature.
Exactly. And over 10,000 arrests. And you really want to talk about Hong Kong? Did you see what the Chinese Foreign Ministry said to, I think it was Pompeo or Pompeo, as he's called in English.
Mm-hmm.
He made some kind of comment about the Hong Kong protests, and one of the members of the Chinese Foreign Ministry just simply tweeted back, "I can't breathe."
Wow. Yeah, I saw that. Interesting perspective, because U.S. Coast Guard secretaries and delegates were in Hong Kong at the beginning of the rioting down there. Okay, they helped incite it. Okay, and they don't want to talk about it. The United States government doesn't want to talk about it. So when U.S. Coast Guard and U.S. Navy tried to dock their warships there, the Chinese government said, "Hell no, you're not going to dock your warships here. Go take a hike."
Yeah.
So, and if you want to go back further, you can go back to the Ukraine with Victoria Nuland on the street giving out cookies to rioters who were attacking police officers in Kiev and strangling demonstrators on the street. Okay, people who are in opposition to these thugs. Sloboda is their name. Sloboda. Their insignia is one step away from a Nazi symbol.
Yeah.
Okay. So they supported this. The United States government supported it. Victoria Nuland was on a phone call that was intercepted by intelligence agencies out in Moscow.
Where they talked about who was going to be ruling the next government and who wasn't. Remember that?
Yes, and they would screw the EU, so to speak.
Yeah.
She used more flagrant language. And so this is playbook. This is textbook. Okay, the Arab Spring. Okay, textbook. When they wanted to overthrow Mubarak, they used the same textbook. Playbook. Sorry.
Well, they used towards the end. They were amenable to the ouster of Mubarak, more so that they could use then the rebellion in Egypt and weaponize it in order to do what they did in Syria and Libya. Mm-hmm. Because as soon as they were able to overthrow the government of Libya, and as soon as they went, I don't even think they waited till they went into Syria. They did a coup against the government that replaced Mubarak, and they brought in Sisi.
No, they brought in democratic election. So they brought in Morsi. Morsi won the election.
Right, but then didn't they overthrow him and bring in
CC came in after. So
yes.
Yeah, so the elections that they had, they said we're going to move to an Arab democratic process.
Mm-hmm.
Even though in Riyadh they do not have democracy, but that's not a problem. Only in only in Africa do you need democracy, and so they tried to run democracy, and the game did not go the way they wanted to go. People voted the other way, and they had no control over it. And the only way to fix it was to get rid of Morsi. Okay, and he ended up dying in prison anyways after they arrested all the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, like I said, they allowed that rebellion and that revolution just long enough until they could weaponize it and use it against Libya and Syria.
Yes.
So, by the way, before time runs away with us again, I suggest that people be a little more careful when taking taxis these days. Did you see what McLeod wrote in Min Press News?
Okay.
He says that during the curfew, cops had these cars that they have a fleet of about 5 cars that look like yellow taxis. And they were using them to arrest demonstrators under the pretext that they were violating the curfew. So as demonstrators were trying to go home, they would have these cops posing as taxi drivers who would pose as taxi drivers and proceed to handcuff them and arrest them as soon as they got into the vehicle. So now, this is not a new thing. It turns out that the cops have had these cars since let's see. They've been using them since 2015, and that information came out as a result of a FOIA request that was done by a journalist by the name of Matthew Guariglia.
Okay.
So I don't know who they've used these taxis against, but they've been using them since 2015. Now, there's a journal called The Gossamist who wrote a checklist about how to spot these fake taxis. And they say that if they have a number that begin with 2W or 2Y, like those license plate numbers, that it's most likely a fake taxi. And also, the meters often look fake, or they're obviously not working.
There usually should be a medallion on them, right? A hackney, or what they call it.
I don't know what real taxis are supposed to have or not have, because I can't see them. I just get in them. I could be a candidate for one of these taxi rides because I can't see a fake one or a real one.
Oh man, yeah, that's very true. That's very true because you're non-sighted. But to that point, they've been known to use UPS trucks, FedEx trucks, DHL, and jump out of them. There's actually excellent video on YouTube that was shared by some people in New York where they said, people were walking around like civilians and then they just jumped out. Dragnet or something like that. It was just something crazy they hadn't seen before. Women pushing strollers and there were no babies inside of it. It's just really weird.
Yes.
Law enforcement. So.
And they've also been caught destroying property.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So,
yeah. Yeah, that's a part of the strategy, right? To pin all of that on the peaceful protesters and say, hey, these people are the people that are causing all this. But I saw some video out in DC where there were peaceful protesters that were on their knees, taking a knee, and law enforcement came by, sprayed them with pepper spray and beat them with clubs. And really interesting how aggressive they are. And there's an actual police term for it. It's called stick duty or something like that. I can't remember the exact term. I think it's called stick duty. Basically, stick duty.
Que cojones. Sorry.
Paraphrasing this is that stick duty means that how many licks you can get in on a civilian with a stick.
Yeah.
Okay. This sort of disgusting idea that they have about policing.
Yeah.
They love that. A lot of these police officers love the idea of rioting because it gives them time to go in there and beat people and take out their aggressions on civilians.
Yeah.
And so this is what we're dealing with here.
Which is their pattern. I mean, once you have somebody handcuffed, because there's nothing that explains you arrested somebody, you have them handcuffed. So what rationale other than sadism, and abuse of power is there for 6, 8, 10 cops, surrounding one person that is already shackled and beating them within an inch of their lives? And what's your take on the Democrats, Mike, and how they're responding to this situation?
They're pandering, obviously, but they look crazy, okay? You have Nancy Pelosi and the rest of these no-name Democrats taking knees with kente cloth around them, looking like Kwanzaa, not really understanding what's going on. The purpose of to take a knee for Kaepernick, okay, was because a U.S. soldier told him to take a knee in opposition to what he believes, okay, during the national anthem at these football games. Now, rewind back a little bit more. The reason why they use the national flag, they roll out this massive flag of 50 yards or something like that, in the national anthem at these games and fly over, F-16s and these fighter jets and these helicopters. It's because that's the military's way of recruiting for the military at these games, because there's 60,000 people at a game, 50,000 people at a game. So it's a way of them recruiting men into the military. Okay? And so Kaepernick decided he was going to take the knee because what the U.S. soldiers did. That being said, these people thought that taking the knee would be a great idea in support of George Floyd when he died because a knee was in his back.
Yeah.
There's so much, the optics on this is so bad. I mean, you got mayors and governors and stuff like that. Everybody's taking a knee. And you got Justin Trudeau, the Playboy of Canada. This guy is taking a knee in a crowd. I mean, they don't get it. They just don't get the optics. They don't get the meaning. They're lost. They're trying to figure out a way to pander to African Americans at this time. And instead of going back and just changing the laws, okay, instead of just enforcing, civil rights for the people, they'd rather take a knee.
Well, I'm not a visual person, as I've said 1 or 2 times every so often. But, when I thought about, when I heard that Pelosi and all these people were taking a knee, I mean, the other thing is, one thing is protesters sort of like taking a page from Kaepernick's book And another thing is to have a person of power taking a knee after a Black man was just killed by someone kneeling on him. And what you're essentially doing is asserting this, this has become another gesture of oppression, another gesture of power. And when you have a person in authority taking a knee, what to me that says is that they're reaffirming that gesture.
Yes.
But the other thing is that you have so many platitudes and at best contradictory actions. You have Amy Klobuchar, for instance, talking about how this has to be investigated, blah, 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 by an outside source, and we can't tolerate this. I've got news for her. She has a few things to answer for, because when she was chief prosecutor in Minnesota, she herself refused to charge dozens of police who were charged with this type of crime, who were charged with crimes of police violence against civilians. And one of the people, interestingly enough, that she refused to charge was the very cop that murdered George Floyd.
Right.
So, what's that about? And then you have Joe Biden, Trump light, talking about the need to reform the police, but he doesn't, he doesn't want to hear of any legislating that would take power away from the police. He doesn't want to hear about defunding the police, about reducing the funds even of the police. He doesn't want to hear, of course, about dismantling the police and having, another alternative to crimes, like restorative justice for one. And in many respects, he's responsible for what we're witnessing now, because his 1994 crime bill is what accelerated the incarceration and further brutalization of people of color. And then you have Miss Hillary Clinton, to whom all of a sudden Black Lives Matter. Weren't there some emails that were leaked, DNC emails, where she instructed some of the people that worked with her that if they came across Black Lives Matter people, that they should listen to them but not commit to any policy regarding the police? But all of a sudden Black Lives Matter to her? Excuse me? And wasn't she the one who coined the phrase super predators?
Absolutely.
And to refer to young men of color?
Yes. And see, that's a part of the failings of the party, right? When she ran in 2016 against the teenage Dream tyrant himself, she says, I carry around a bottle of hot sauce all the time, in terms of referencing her relation to the African-American community. Okay, this is the foolishness. Kamala Harris, who dropped out of this recent race, she did the Wakanda sign, and she admitted that she smoked marijuana as a way to pander to the African-American vote. This is the failings of the party. Okay, they just can't seem to get it right. They're all over the place. They're always trying to appeal in some kind of way. You have what do you call it? The senator of Vermont.
What's his face? Sanders?
Yeah, Bernie Sanders, thank you, who prides himself on marching with Martin Luther King. This is the sort of strategy that they have. They're always trying to pander in a way that says, my friend is Black. And so
yes.
you should be my, you should vote for me because my friend was Black. I had Black friends, and so this is the feelings of the party. And they listen
to Aretha Franklin.
Oh yeah. Yeah, they went Popeye
And that's about the size of it.
Mhm. Yeah, remember Bill Clinton? He plays the saxophone.
Yes.
Okay, that was
Yes.
1992. He played.
Yes. Bill Clinton, who bombed a Sudanese uh, pharmaceutical company in the Sudan, and who not only killed the people that were in that facility, but people that had nothing to do with whatever pretext he used for that bombing. But he also caused the death, according to the ambassador of Germany at the time, of tens of thousands of Sudanese people, because the destruction of that particular factory left them without the medicines that they needed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then you have him supporting George Butcher Sr.'s coup against Aristide, who was the first democratically elected leader that Haiti had in a very long time, thanks to the Duvalier dynasty that the U.S. had imposed on that country. And
Yep.
both, Bill supported it, and then you had Hillary Clinton, that is Secretary of State, promoted what, for all intents and purposes, became another invasion and occupation of Haiti after the earthquake.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because Nancy Pelosi and the rest of the party was over there in Ghana last year in 2019 for the right of abode. Okay, they went to the slave ports. Okay, there's pictures all over the internet about this. Her, Elon Omar, and the rest of these people went over there. These officials went over there. For what reason, I don't know, but to hang out with the president of Ghana.
Uh-huh.
Now, at the funeral of George Floyd, there was a delegation from Ghana, a delegation that came to speak on behalf of Ghana, for whatever reason, at this at the funeral. And so what I'm seeing here, when you ask me the question, what do I think about the Democrats? What I'm seeing here is that they're expanding their base now. Okay, they're trying to go all the way into the continent and in other parts of Latin America. Okay,
Uh-huh.
Hillary Clinton's been known to have been in Central America, Honduras,
Yeah.
okay, and also Haiti. The Clinton Foundation. Bill Clinton has been down there. They're trying to expand their support and try to have this sort of momentum going into November up against the Tangerine Tyrant and his posse.
Yeah.
If this does not work, then they're soiled. They're fractured into 1,000 pieces. Now, if it doesn't work for the Republican Party, they're finished as well, because they don't have the diversity to really speak to at this climate. Okay, the protests, the demonstrations are in complete opposition to their party as a whole. So we talk about regime change within America. This has been a orange revolution happening in their own country, where people are fed up with those who are in power, and whoever's in power right now is feeling the brunt force of it. Like you said, you had this gringo hiding in the basement of the White House, in his man cave down there, plotting and scheming, looking for ways to get out of the country. But this is not the first time this has happened. In 1995, during the Million Man March, Clinton, the United States military, the Secret Service, flew Clinton out of the White House, out of Washington, when all of those people showed up to the rally. Okay, Million Man March. They said almost 2 million.
Oh, I remember that march.
Yes. So this is not the first time that they've gotten the president out of Dodge or tried to hide him because of potential overthrow and uprising against false leadership in the country. But now you have this, these Democrats taking a knee. It's almost as if they're saying, this is the position you need to take when we take power in November, okay?
Yeah.
Take the knee when you see us, bow before us, kneel before
Yeah.
us.
Exactly. Yeah. There was no way that I could not, that I couldn't have interpreted it that way. I didn't see it, like within the same light as I saw Kaepernick's protest. Not at all. He was Kaepernick. These were people in power taking a knee after somebody used his knee to kill someone.
Yes.
It's one of the most offensive gestures that I've seen. And speaking of which, because all these people are talking about coming to terms with what our history has been, during slavery. Well, never mind that the whole process of mass incarceration, the privatization of prisons, and the use of prisons as sources of labor for corporations have essentially, for all intents and purposes, brought into the United States de facto slavery. But one of the things that I wanted to point out about the U.S. destruction of Libya was that one of the consequences of the so-called democracy that war criminal Obama and Hillary, brought to that country was that aside from fragmenting it in all the country, aside from stealing their resources, it brought slave markets.
Yes.
Libya is a virtual slave market right now. It brought slave markets and the cleansing of Black Libyans, because the forces they supported, that's what they were about. And, so when people contemplate their lives in chains in a slave market in Libya, they have Hillary Clinton and Obama to thank for that.
Right. We came, we saw, he died. Famous words.
And we enslaved.
Yes. Famous words of Democratic hopeful Hillary Clinton. Hillary Rodham Clinton. Remember the name.
And what does this all have to do with police brutality? Well, that police brutality in the United States is really not that different from the brutality of US foreign policy. The United States government is still fighting quote unquote Indian wars and enslavement wars against people of color. And they're doing it within the borders of the United States and outside those borders as well.
I think that's a good way to end this show. We're just over an hour mark. So.
Oh shoot! I didn't know I'd gone that long.
No, it's good. I think we have some pretty good dialogue here. You have any closing thoughts?
No, only that people should beware of this is the fight against racism and racist tyranny in the United States is a long fight, but people should beware of particularly people within their own, the government of the US who are going to use their struggle as a means of getting electoral, as a means of running for office. Don't allow your struggle to be used opportunistically by the same people that have oppressed you before.
Yeah, absolutely. I second those sentiments as well. But thank you all for joining us. And thank you to Martha for actually participating and co-hosting this as well. Please hit the like button if you'd already done so, and share the video if possible with other colleagues who are in the struggle.
Thank you.
All right, shalom, everyone.